Welcome to Group 1's presentation on Uber, a ride-sharing and so much more app and software platform. I'm Oliver Wolf, and Chris Bloom, Jason Woodworth, and I are taking turns narrating this presentation. We hope you enjoy.
We're going to talk about several things. This is an overview of what is going to be discussed in this presentation. We're going to talk about the business objectives, the objectives that drive this company and the CEO and this team to make money. We're going to talk about the resources that they need. We're going to talk about, specific to intellectual property, we're going to talk about their core and peripheral intellectual property. Some other items, whether or not they need intellectual property to be developed or acquired or added to, and then some options to protect that intellectual property. We're going to affix a price to the intellectual property, so an IP valuation is going to occur. We're going to talk about a budget and then a plan of execution on how they can promote their business objective.
So what is Uber? Uber is a service. It's a mobile platform first and foremost, but it wants to be everyone's private driver. That's their trademark phrase, the first thing you see after the logo when you open the app. What does Uber do? It connects drivers and passengers. It's a service. It does not provide cabs. It provides a communication avenue for drivers to find new clients. And they want it to be hassle-free and pleasant for both parties. At the same time, Uber is a rapidly expanding and diversifying company, largely due to their service-based model and not their taxi or car-based model. That being said, Uber's clear business objective is to deliver products quickly, comfortably, and with style. The group was started in 2009 by 4 grad students with the idea that they just wanted to show up to an event in San Francisco, not in a dingy old taxi, but in a Lincoln Town Car. They wanted to show up as looking wealthier than they were, and they wanted to show up balling out, as they said. And that whole idea turned into this business objective of building a service that delivers products quickly, comfortably, and with style. And as you'll see, it's an incredibly scalable concept. Uber's expansion strategy is based off its disruptive product and how scalable its system is. It's an app, it's a service that connects 2 people together using algorithms and pricing models that Uber owns. That model, paired with Uber's amazing earned media success, gives it a huge competitive advantage with its expansion. Promotional events such as delivering campers to people ready to be folded out in Campton, or delivering helicopters for flights from New York City to the Hamptons and back, or even delivering kittens to be petted for several minutes at a time, to show the facility of use which Uber's software has. At the same time, Uber faces pretty stiff competition across the board. While no one company does quite what Uber does in terms of providing a luxury service quickly and efficiently, there are other disruptive companies out there like Lyft and Sidecar who provide ride-sharing services similar to taxis, but it's generally a person-to-person basis. There's very little professional drivers involved as opposed to Uber. There are defensive companies like Taxi Magic and Flywheel. They provide a similar service to Uber, but on behalf of the taxi companies. And there's a huge potential for their growth into the future. And then, of course, there's the traditional local taxi companies who hold, at the very least, a political advantage over all other competition by dint of their being present for 3, 4, 5 decades in a city, if not more. So what's happening today with Uber? The first thing we want to make clear is Uber's past success is by no means indicative of future earnings. There's so much competition out there that Uber needs to stay on top of its game in order to keep succeeding. Uber faces a very significant resource challenge. They're sitting on piles of cash from several successful venture capital raising rounds, but at the same time, their whole business expansion strategy assumes that there are quality drivers in every location they want to move to. Enough quality drivers to both meet demand and be within 5 minutes of any potential customer at any time. And the truth of the matter is that there's not that many quality drivers. They can throw as much money as they want at the issue. And it'll be hard to create new quality drivers until the market adjusts itself and new drivers appear on the market. At the same time, Uber has an outsider status in local municipalities that hurts their local expansion efforts. They come in and they're faced with an entrenched taxi union in certain towns, and that makes expansion extremely difficult. That same outsider status has led to significant legal challenges for Uber. Where taxi companies are entrenched with local government officials, they've been whining and dining them for years and have lobbyists working in their favor, Uber comes in as an outsider and has to deal with new municipal laws getting in their way. For instance, some towns have prohibited black limo cars or black sedans from picking up clients. Some areas have prohibited charging fares based on GPS location. Uber has to deal with each of these on an individual level at the municipal level, not the state or federal. By doing this in a smaller level, Uber is forced to spread its legal presence thinly. It struggles its growth, it hinders its growth, and Uber is also forced to deal with these little things rather than federal cases, which could form good precedents for them. At the same time, there are also patent trolls attacking Uber and similar companies like Lyft, where inventors come forward with patents they claim Uber is violating, and Uber has to deal with those on a similar level. Uber faces competition on all fronts. They're unique in their business model, but other companies infringe on different areas of their competitive space. First, Lyft, among other companies, is lifting some of Uber's design and style features, both in terms of appearance and recently in the price surge, the sensitive price system that Uber implemented, which is one of their core pieces of IP, as we'll discuss later. At the same time, Uber struggles with expansion both from human resources and from legal fronts, leaves room open for smaller companies to come in and take some market space that Uber would have had otherwise. And thirdly, we aren't quite sure how protectable Uber's intellectual property actually is. They have 10 patents either being applied for or in place, and several trade dress marks and brand marks, but a lot of it is intuitive, and it's really questionable how valuable a lot of that is, as we'll discuss later.
Now we're going to talk about core and peripheral IP, intellectual property. Well, Uber delivers packages much like a FedEx or UPS, except what they deliver are cars and a driver, and they do this all within 5 minutes. So they have to have tremendous complex algorithms that go into delivering these products, the car and the driver, to the customers in such a short amount of time. I mean, think about it. FedEx and UPS, they have all day now. They have a greater amount of distance usually to cover. But Uber does this within 5 minutes.
So Uber's app, which is available on both the Android and the Apple Store, has several pieces of functionality that help it get to these 5-minute marks with no zeros, as they call it. A zero is when someone cannot find a car in the area. They have several core pieces of their functionality of their IP that lets them do this. The first of which, and we believe the most important of which for Uber, is their surge pricing algorithm. This allows them, much like airplanes and hotels, to match the price with the demand and the supply available. For instance, on New Year's in 2010 in New York City, right after midnight, Uber's prices went up 6.5 times their normal rates just to keep enough cars on the street for people to be able to get a car, and also to incentivize other drivers to join the pool available. At the same time, Uber also has a location determination system which uses the inaccuracies of cell phone GPS paired with traditional pickup points and historical landmarks and popular points, such as a hotel, and logically deduces where the person is actually requesting a ride for or from. Those two things paired together are enough to put Uber ahead of the pack by a long shot. And when you transition into the fact that Uber has these patents to transition between pages in its app to make the whole experience more free-flowing, to go between rate the driver to your location, to the request, to the payment sharing, and the payment method, it all falls into Uber's core IP. On the periphery, Uber also has some pretty valuable IP, not least of which is their user feedback and rating system, which lets users rate a driver after the ride and keeps an average grade for each driver, which you can check before you even get in the car to make sure that the driver's safe, has a good record, and that you want to ride with them. As well, at the end, they have a digital receipt generation system. Uber is completely paperless, and recently they even partnered with PayPal, so now it's completely cardless too if you just want to link it straight to your bank account. You get out of the car, it automatically charges your account and sends you a digital receipt. At the same time, on the driver's side, they compile all the driver's income and send it on a weekly or monthly basis to the IRS, keeping Uber completely middleman and completely free of financial tangles in the future. In terms of brand and trade dress, Uber has some key trademarks and some key functions. They have trademarks for all their key sections, Uber, UberX, the recently started Uber Taxi, and several other subsections of their company. They've registered their logo. They actually changed their colors and the shape to make it something that they could register internationally. They also have seen a rising use of Uber as a verb, as in I'm going to Uber myself a Lincoln tonight, Uber myself over to my buddy's place, or how'd you get home? Oh, I got an Uber back home, or I Ubered back home. Currently, that's good for them, good for their brand recognition, but as long as it's only being used referring to the Uber brand, that black town car brand which is so recognizable and sets it apart from everyone else. So what happens if Uber doesn't do anything? What happens if they just ride out the current model and enjoy their current success and see how far it can take them? Well, if they do that, at least they start happy with the fact they're an industry leader. They've got creative marketing, as we've talked about, and their expansion has been pretty successful, even with the roadblocks that we've referred to. There's not much stopping them from a positive outlook at the moment. At the moment, that's the case, but in the future, things will look a little bit more dreary. For one, there's the direct and similar competition we've talked about that, if Uber's not careful, could easily usurp Uber. There's Uber's facing their limited human resources issues, and the market share could go away from their favor. A lot of that stems from the fact that while their brand is strong, it's not fully established. It's not a brand that everybody in the country is aware of. It's not a brand that even people in cities where Uber's really successful are aware of. All that takes is a few hiccups along the road for a company like Lyft or Sidecar to jump out in front. And at the same time, Uber is going to have those lawsuits piling up if they don't do anything to prevent them. So what should Uber do? I mean, we know one thing: they should not sit still. This market's growing, it's competitive, but it is growing. It's a market and they need to stay in it. And we believe that IP acquisition, intellectual property acquisition and development is truly key here. So what should they develop and what should they acquire? Well, we think first and foremost they should develop a price prediction system. Increase the usability of what they already have and separate them from the pack of hangers-ons and copycats. They already have the data. They've had years of data of users, especially in major cities, to show the average prices at average times of day, etc. There's very little that stops them besides manpower and effort from developing a part of their software, an intellectual property piece that helps them predict prices in certain cities. Secondly, they could implement a more dynamic review system. Currently, users can only review at the end of a ride. Why not review during a ride if there's a certain thing that frustrates them, and alert the taxi driver more easily rather than weeks afterwards or days afterwards? And finally, why they need to develop an interface for future functions. As we said, Uber is diversifying. They need to go ahead, and if they want to be a courier service, if they want to be a helicopter delivery service, develop what they need intellectually in intellectual property terms in order to facilitate that. Do it in advance. Don't do little steps, do big steps in their development process. At the same time, Uber's sitting on piles of cash. They should acquire. And one of the things we think they should acquire first is the shortest route algorithm. What happens when an Uber taxi driver who's already making 50 to 75% more than an average taxi driver on the same route takes a longer route and gyps the user? Not all users know what the shortest route should be, and Uber should alert them. Find a way to alert them if the driver is being a little bit sketchy on that front. And that's something that they can acquire. There's companies like Taxomatic in Vienna, Austria that already has something like that and doesn't seem to be doing that successfully. So Uber, there's potential there for some acquisition. At the same time, Uber's big issue is finding new markets with enough talent to support the Uber model, with enough talented drivers. And there are companies out there, while they might not do it for car services, they go out and find new talent, new markets, and they introduce them to the original company, kind of a headhunter, but for new markets. And Uber would do well to acquire, if not the whole company, then at least the intellectual property aspects that allows them to do that. And there's some flexibility in there, some ambiguity, we're aware, but the potential is there. At the same time, Uber's the money king in this market. They need to acquire, we believe, anything with strategic potential. Keep the other people out. Just go out there and be the big dog and fight off everybody else by preempting everybody else. And finally, in the same preemption line of thought, they want to expand and diversify. They need to go ahead and move out there and find the companies who are doing it best, but maybe need some help, and either buy their IP from them or incorporate them into the Uber company. At the same time, Uber can develop or acquire as much IP as they want, but it's only valuable so long as they protect it well. How are they going to do that? Two ways. One, by being aggressive in defense, and the other by being a little bit passive in other areas. So how are they going to be aggressive? First, their core piece of IP, as we determined, was surge pricing. And there are other companies now, rideshare, sidecar, they're all coming in to attack Uber's pricing model, their surge pricing, flexible pricing model. They're doing it in little ways by calling the payment a donation instead of a payment, so they can differentiate from Uber's market. And Uber needs to be really aggressive in preventing that from happening, because that's the one thing that separates Uber from everyone else. It's their availability of providing a car within 5 minutes. They can do it consistently, they can do it professionally. At the same time, Uber needs to protect its trade dress. They have that black town car label almost part of their brand, and they could theoretically defend that in court aggressively. At the same time, Uber is being used as a verb, as we discussed, and they just need to make sure and monitor that it's only being used in reference to Uber, the same way that Coke defends its product. And finally, they need to be aggressive as the big dogs and picketing around certain areas. Buy up the IP, the little pieces of IP, develop little pieces of IP, use their money to prevent other competitors from expanding into Uber's market or continuing growth. So if they're going to be aggressive in all those areas, what's left for them to be passive about? First, they need to let the market speak for them. Uber's really powerful, and they don't need to be too aggressive in fighting off small attackers when the client base is so strongly in their favor. For instance, when moving into a new town, Uber is often able to get past municipal laws or get them overturned largely because of local demand, because clients from other areas come back and the market demands that Uber is allowed in, and Uber doesn't have to do that much about it to be allowed into the market, where before they were blocked. Second, they need to continue their strong expansion. That's not really IP strategy. It's more just continue what they're doing. They're doing something right. They're doing a lot of things right. Just keep it going. And thirdly, they just need to work on developing functional IP. Their IP is based around a service. They need to keep building things that enhance that service. As we mentioned, the ability to find the best route, the ability to predict a price. Lots of little things Uber can be doing to build their core values while still passively holding off the market by separating themselves from the rest.
Next, we're going to take a look at the valuation of Uber's IP. Before we get started, I want to address a couple different issues. First off, Uber is actually currently a privately owned company. So there's actually a lack of total financial information on this. So in order to do some of these IP valuations, assumptions had to be made. We also have to consider some of the rumors. There is a ton of industry rumors that have been floating around, and we decided to take what we deemed as the most reliable. Finally, the company's value truly is in its service, which makes it in itself very difficult to value, and it's expanding rapidly. So where does the value come from? First, we wanted to take a look at the actual market valuation that occurred over the summer. There was another round of funding that was created from a bunch of venture capitalists and early investors, and an additional $361 million was given to Uber from multiple investors. One large investor was actually Google, who paid $258 million for their portion of it. The value of this market valuation was ranging roughly between $3.5 billion to $3.6 billion. When we look to value the IP of this, we actually made some key assumptions. We said, A, the people that were involved were actually logical investors. They knew what they were doing. They did their own calculations. So we actually assumed that the markets were pretty efficient. We also said that the data from July 2013 is actually pretty consistent with what it would be now, that not too much time has transpired. And finally, we invested a lot of the investment capital and the tangible assets, and we made assumptions for what some of those tangible assets are worth. The total valuations that we came up with was roughly $3.2 billion after everything was said and done. The next method that we used was the discounted cash flow method. The assumptions that we made were that revenue was going to continue to grow, and we actually began with the $125 million of revenue that existed in 2012. We also applied a standard international tax rate to reflect the fact that Uber is an international company. You can't exactly get an exact value for some of the tax without some of the financials. And finally, we took these discounted cash flows for over 20 years. With this valuation, we came up with roughly $4.5 billion over the 20-year span. Finally, we asked ourselves, how big does Uber compare to the rest of the taxi market? We decided to take a look at the U.S. market to kind of give it some scale. Based on discounted cash flows from the current $10 billion a year industry that is the U.S. taxi market, we came up with the following figures. If Uber only captures 1% of the market, they'll have $1.3 billion valuation. All the way up until, of course, 10%, where they capture a $13.4 billion market after discounted cash flows. We recognize that this market share method may not be the most appropriate method to use. However, we do think it'd be very useful as a negotiations tool. When we went and looked at the valuation of IP and other methods of doing it, we decided to discard the replacement value and the cost of development of the IP. The replacement value simply because there is no replacement. It's unique. For the cost of development, it was created by 4 graduate students. It's significantly worth more than what it costs to develop.
Uber is clearly on top of the world of luxury ride delivery right now, but its aggressive expansion raises plenty of concerns going forward. Our recommendation, how Uber should continue to expand, what their plan of execution should be, is to double down on its efforts and build on its strengths, but do it fast, do it quickly. Competition's not lagging far behind. They've got to double down in 3 ways. First, they need to double down on defense. As we've already talked about, they need to aggressively pursue patent infringements, especially against their surge pricing model. If they allow that to continue with other companies, they lose a huge competitive advantage that they have. Second, they're being attacked on the municipal level, and they're expanding internationally. They need to invest in a legal bullpen, lawyers whom can defend them at a regular basis, and across the board, they can't spread themselves thin. They have the money, throw it at lawyers. Third, they need to pursue complementary IP for their current functions. As we've talked about, they need to build and separate themselves by pure value of what they offer, by pure value add. If they do more than the others do, then they'll have a better defensive position to start from. Well, the second place where they need to double down is on expansion. As we talked about, they need to implement picket strategy on U.S. IP, preventing others from moving into their intellectual property space or hindering expansion that's already happening. They need to register key intellectual property in expansion locations. Uber's moving internationally. They have locations all across Europe. They just recently expanded to Colombia. They're moving into Asia and Hong Kong. They need to register their key IP in those expansion locations to ward off future competition and other expanded companies like rideshare and Lyft. Same time, they need to continue their expansion into new sectors. We talked about a courier service where you could have a package delivered across town or across cities quickly by a personal driver. They need to develop advanced teams and strategy. The big thing is that they're moving into these new markets and they're doing them reactively. They get in there, they figure out what the issues are, and then they have to struggle with those issues. If they can send in advanced teams and form advanced strategies, they'll drastically increase their expansion rate and success rate. Lastly, they need to acquire market entry IP. As we discussed earlier, there are companies out there that specialize in entering new markets or identifying new markets for entry. Uber needs to find one that meshes with its service model and either acquire the company or its intellectual property and incorporate it into Uber's day-to-day expansion operations. The big thing here is that Uber needs to not take little steps. Little steps will keep them slightly ahead of the competition, and they might lag behind in the future. They need to keep making big moves and not hinder themselves with one sector of business. They need to keep making big moves and continue to stay far ahead of the scalable economy behind them. And finally, Uber needs to double down on spending. We've got a huge war chest, hundreds of millions of dollars. Over 200 million just in the past venture capital raising from Google's startup venture capital firm. It was over 80% of Google's yearly allocation went solely to Uber. They've got a ton of money. And that war chest allows them to enter markets faster, to pursue legal action more effectively and faster, more quickly. It allows them to smother competition. They moved into some cities after Lyft, but threw money at it, threw money at drivers and undercut Lyft and drove Lyft out of business in that area. It also gives them increased visibility, both by buying PR hits, by successful legal action, and by being able to afford promotional stunts, even though they're really philanthropical. But for instance, with the recent LAX shooting, Uber provided free taxis for anyone who wanted to leave the airport in time because taxis weren't allowed in. During Hurricane Sandy, they provided discount rates for everybody out of their own pocket because they can afford to. And finally, they need to use that money to expand into new sectors, as we've covered extensively earlier. Uber really is on top of this market, and they've got a good financial backing, the best in the market. They've got a good plan. They've got a really, really charismatic leadership, and they've got a very workable and scalable business model. They just need to stay on top of it, stay aggressive, and we believe that their intellectual property will carry them through.